I have a question for you this morning. How do we keep things that are clean and pristine, clean and pristine? How do we keep clean and pristine things clean and pristine? So imagine in your home, in your living room, you have a sofa. And imagine that the sofa is clean and pristine. The sofa is white. How do you keep a white sofa white? And how do you think about keeping that white sofa white in the context, say, of inviting company for dinner? Let's imagine that that company has a 4-year-old child. Let's imagine that that 4-year-old likes chocolate. Let's imagine that that 4-year-old has chocolaty fingers. How do you think about the close encounter of a 4-year-old's chocolaty fingers with what had been your formerly white sofa? Now, this is not only a practical question. It is also very deeply a philosophical question. It's mamash a philosophical question. Because the question of how we keep our white sofa white is prismatic of deeper issues like how we live our lives. Like, how do we think about mess? M-E-S-S. Mess. That is just an inevitable part of being a human being. And there are basically two schools of thought. One school of thought is keep off the white sofa. Don't sit on the white sofa. One school of thought is that white sofa is not meant to be sat on. It's only meant to be stared at. Did any of you grow up in a home with your parents or grandparents or great-grandparents where the reigning school of thought was don't sit on the white sofa, just stare at the white sofa? My late Booby, she in fact had 2 different levels of protection for that white sofa. It was in the living room, but you could not enter the living room. The living room was not for living. The living room was for staring. But just in case a human being actually dared venture into the living room that was not for living, she put thick, plastic, crinkly cover over anything that one could sit on. Did anyone grow up in such a home? Yeah. Don't sit on the white sofa. That's one move. But there's a second move. And it is embodied by a very beautiful place in Eretz Yisrael. It's embodied by a museum in Haifa called the Hecht Museum. Now, the Hecht Museum in Haifa is famous for 2 things. It's famous for housing very ancient, very unique, and very irreplaceable, and very precious artifacts. And it's famous because it has a very definite point of view of how it's going to showcase these artifacts, namely up close and personal. Nothing is behind a case. Nothing is behind the bar. Nothing is cordoned off. Nothing is there to be stared at and not seen. To the contrary, everything is there, up close and personal. The director of this museum, a woman named Imbal Rivlin, says there is a special charm. There is a special charm when today's visitors can look at and have no distance between an ancient object in the same way that people from long ago would have encountered that object. Now, One of the objects they have is an artifact. It's a jar that is 3,500 years old. The experts date it from the year 2200 to 1500 before the Common Era. To put that in historical context, King David reigned 1,000 years before the Common Era. So this jar is hundreds of years older than King David. And this ancient jar is the first thing you see when you walk into the museum. It was resting on a thin metal stand, totally unprotected and totally exposed. And that, on Thursday, is where it was when parents and a 4-year-old child walked into the museum. Now, this 4-year-old child did not have chocolaty fingers. He had something else. He had curiosity. He had splendid curiosity. I wonder what's inside this cool jar. And because it wasn't cordoned off, and because it wasn't protected, because it was right there, he was able to satisfy his curiosity. In fact, he was able to satiate his curiosity. He just went like this to reach inside and see what's inside this cool jar. And as you might expect, it tipped over, it toppled over, it fell over, and it shattered. And there began an immediate and international news story. Now, the father of this 4-year-old, a guy named Alex, and can you imagine what it would be like to be the parents of this 4-year-old? Worse yet, could you imagine what it would be like to be the grandparents of this 4-year-old? Alex says as follows: my initial reaction was denial. I couldn't believe it was my son who did it. At first, I was in shock, and then I felt a bit angry with him. So their son began to cry, and they went to security and to the museum personnel, and they said, we got to own what our family did. Come and take a look and inspect the damage. So how do we keep clean and pristine things clean and pristine? And it turns out that Judaism has a definite point of view. Judaism has a definite point of view on this question. And it turns out that the Hecht Museum in Haifa is not only deeply Israeli, it is also deeply Jewish. Because the most sacred thing that we, the Jewish people, ever had, without question, by far, the most sacred thing was Luchot HaBrit, the first set of tablets. Sacred because it was made by God. God did it. Sacred because it contained God's words for how we should live. And you know the rest of the story. The rest of the story is Moses takes these tablets, sacred, made by God, containing God's words, down the mountain. He sees the Israelites worshiping the golden calf, and he hurls the tablets, and he shatters them. Life is a contact sport. And what happens next is so interesting. The Torah reports that what happens next is that Moses creates a second set of tablets, and the Talmud reports that what happens next is that they went out and got and gathered all of the broken pieces of the first tablets, and they took the broken pieces of the first tablets and the whole second tablets, and they put it all together inside the Aron Kodesh, the Ark of the Covenant, and the broken set of the first tablets and the whole set of the second tablets together accompanied the Israelites through their wilderness wandering. So here's what's so important. Don't forget this. If you remember nothing else, remember this. What is most prized and most holy in Judaism and the Torah, what is most prized and most holy is not a thing. Things break. What is most prized and most holy is a quality. And the quality is the quality of resilience. The quality is that when mess happens, and to be alive, mess happens. To be alive means shattered pieces happen. To be alive means you encounter broken pieces. It's unavoidable, it's inescapable, it's ineluctable, it is inevitable, it is human. To be alive is to face broken. To be alive is to face shattered. To be alive is to face pieces. And what is most holy and what is most prized is the ability to learn from what just happened and to keep on going. Now, I first encountered this whole idea 30 years ago when I was at the seminary. I had a philosophy professor named Neil Gilman. And he wrote this whole work on Jewish philosophy. And what he had to say is so interesting, if you think about it. I mean, go back to 30 years ago. We're still in the 20th century. And he says, we've got to just think about God very differently. Because how do we understand how God roles in the world in light of the 20th century? How do we understand God's role with, let's say, the Holocaust, and then 3 years later, the establishment of the State of Israel? What's God's role with the Holocaust? And if you say God's role with the Holocaust, that's not God. Don't blame God. It's people. It's bad people. It's indifferent people. It's people who were silent in the face of evil. It's not God. It's people. If that's what you say, if you're going to give God a pass on the Holocaust, how can we pray what we just prayed? Give God credit for the establishment of Israel. How does that work? And what Neil Gilman said is our theology, all of our categories, all of our thinking, it's broken, it's shattered, and it has to get reconstituted. And he named his book Sacred Fragments based on this idea from the Talmud that the first set of tablets were shattered, but they were still holy. And we had to come up with a second set of tablets. And Neil Gilman says we have to come up with a whole second set of tablets, even as we treasure the tablets, the broken pieces that no longer quite work, to explain the complexity of our world. And clearly after October 7th, Israel is also, our beloved Eretz Israel, is likely in need of mending and repair. After shattered comes learning from shattered and moving forward, which leads us to that moment when the parents and the child are kind of freaking out because a 3,500-year-old jar is now shattered. So here's what happens next, and this is just so cool. The director of the museum, Imbal Rivlin, makes a public statement, and she says, "The museum is not a mausoleum, but a living place, open to families and accessible. We are appealing to parents. Don't be afraid. Things like this happen. We will fix the jar and put it back." That was their public statement. And what they did privately to this family was they said, you have to come back. We cannot let your last experience in this museum be the breaking of this jar. Come back. We want to sweeten, that was her word, sweeten your experience. You're going to come back when the jar is restored, and then you're going to see the delights in our museum. So, how do we keep clean and pristine things clean and pristine? And the answer is we can't. And the answer is we don't. And the answer is we don't get thrown off by the fact that we can't and that we don't. That's why the Hech Museum still has irreplaceable, ancient, 1,000-year-plus items available for close inspection. That's why the family's going to come back to see the jar restored. That's why the first set of tablets that were broken were holy and gathered up with the second set of tablets, and both accompanied the Israelites on the wilderness wanderings. And that's why under every Jewish chuppah, the groom shatters the glass. They're shattered pieces. And what do? The couple hugs, the couple kisses, the couple walks forward hand in hand in strength. When glass shatters, and it does, and it will. When that white sofa gets stained, and it does, and it will. We clean it, we mend it, we fix it, we pick up, we move on. Because life is a contact sport. Shabbat shalom. We continue.